The most expensive mistake an HOA can make is forgetting who controls the water. The first thing I noticed wasn't the music. It was the smell. Fresh cedar lumber, expensive marine fuel, and champagne drifting across the morning air where there should have been nothing but clean water and the familiar scent of pine trees warming beneath the Texas sun. Then came the applause. Hundreds of people lined the shoreline wearing pressed polo shirts and summer dresses, raising glasses while a string quartet played beside a marina I had never approved, never signed for, and never imagined anyone would be reckless enough to build. They called it Lake Evergreen Community Marina. A polished bronze sign shimmered beneath blue skies, mounted on stone pillars that sat directly on the shoreline my grandfather purchased in 1962. My shoreline. My private lake. My land. My fingers tightened around an old brass key resting in my pocket as I stood unnoticed beneath a grove of oak trees overlooking the celebration. 24 boat slips stretched across the water like polished fingers reaching into something that never belonged to them. Luxury pontoons bobbed gently beside floating docks. Fresh concrete walkways curved toward a waterfront clubhouse with floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the morning sunlight. Someone had easily spent $2 million creating a postcard-perfect marina. The guests admired every inch of it. I only saw evidence. Every piling driven into the lake bed. Every dock anchored below the surface. Every electrical conduit buried beneath my property. Every smiling face celebrating a grand opening that should never have happened. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 36 years old, and I build water systems for a living. Reservoirs. Spillways. Flood control projects. Most people see a lake and think about fishing or sunsets. I automatically calculate water elevation, drainage volume, sediment levels, and gate pressure without even trying. My father used to laugh about it, saying our family didn't just own water. We understood it. That understanding started long before I was born, passed from my grandfather to my father, and finally to me beside the small maintenance shed hidden behind a row of cedar trees at the north end of the property. Most visitors never noticed the shed. Even fewer realized what sat inside. Apparently, the Willow Ridge HOA never bothered to ask. They never knocked on my door. They never requested permission. They simply decided my lake looked prettier as their newest neighborhood attraction. According to the glossy flyers I later found in local coffee shops, homeowners would enjoy exclusive boating privileges, sunset events, fishing tournaments, waterfront weddings, and premium property values thanks to their bold vision for community improvement. Their president smiled proudly in every advertisement as if she'd personally discovered the shoreline. Watching everyone celebrate that morning, I almost felt sorry for them. They had invested millions into floating docks, polished railings, luxury landscaping, and elegant ribbon-cutting ceremonies. They believed they'd built something permanent. They believed the lake would always be there exactly as they saw it that morning. What none of them realized was that the water beneath every boat, every dock, every champagne toast, answered to one quiet place hidden behind those cedar trees, and to the old brass key resting calmly in my pocket. I kept watching the celebration from the shade because there was nothing to gain by interrupting people who believed they had already won. The breeze carried the sound of boat engines idling against brand new docks while gulls circled overhead, completely unaware that the shoreline beneath them had been part of my family's life for more than 60 years. My grandfather, Walter Walker, bought this lake in 1962 for less than the price of a new pickup truck. Back then, nobody wanted it. The shoreline was overgrown, the access road turned into mud every spring, and the old earthen dam leaked just enough to make neighboring ranchers laugh at him. My grandfather only smiled and kept working. He believed water would always be more valuable than people realized. Every Saturday morning, he would wake my father before sunrise, load shovels and tools into an old Ford truck, and spend the day clearing brush, reinforcing the shoreline, and maintaining the spillway by hand. By the time I was old enough to follow them around, the routine had become a family tradition. I still remember the smell of wet cedar after summer rain, the rough grain of weathered dock boards beneath my bare feet, and the steady metallic click each time my grandfather tested the control wheel inside the maintenance shed. He treated that mechanism with more respect than most people give expensive sports cars. He always said that water only looked peaceful because someone was quietly doing the work nobody noticed. My father inherited that lesson, and eventually so did I. While other kids spent weekends playing baseball, I learned how to inspect drainage pipes, measure water elevation, and recognize the difference between healthy shoreline vegetation and invasive growth. It probably sounds strange, but those mornings never felt like chores. They felt like conversations passed from one generation to the next without needing many words. After college, I became a hydraulic engineer because it was the only career that ever made sense to me. I spent years helping counties improve reservoirs, reinforce aging dams, and design flood control systems that protected entire communities. Every project reminded me of home. Every valve, every spillway gate, every elevation survey brought back memories of my grandfather's quiet confidence. When he passed away, ownership of the lake transferred to my father. 5 years later, after cancer took him far sooner than anyone expected, everything became mine. Along with the property came several heavy binders filled with maintenance logs, engineering drawings, inspection reports, handwritten notes, and permits dating back decades. Most people would have seen dusty paperwork collecting space on a shelf. I saw the history of every decision my family had ever made. I never imagined those old documents would become the most valuable inheritance my father could have left me. Meanwhile, the neighborhood surrounding the lake kept growing. Ranches disappeared. Luxury homes replaced open fields. The Willow Ridge subdivision expanded year after year until my private shoreline became the only piece of undeveloped waterfront left in the entire area. New residents admired the lake from behind decorative fences and perfectly trimmed lawns. Many assumed it belonged to everyone because they could see it from their back patios. They never asked who actually owned it. Someone else apparently made sure they never had a reason to ask. The first time I met Victoria Langford, she smiled like we had been neighbors for years. The scent of expensive perfume drifted across my driveway as she stepped out of a spotless white sport utility vehicle wearing a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my fishing boat. She extended her hand before introducing herself as president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association, speaking with the polished confidence of someone who expected every conversation to end in agreement. She complimented the lake first, then my house, then the view. Only after several minutes of pleasant conversation did she reveal why she had actually come. She said the neighborhood had reached an exciting turning point. Property values were climbing. More families were moving in. Investors loved waterfront communities. She believed the lake deserved to become the centerpiece of the entire subdivision. I remember laughing because I honestly thought she was joking. When I explained that the lake was private property and had never been part of the subdivision, her smile barely changed. It simply became thinner, colder, like a door quietly closing. She nodded politely, thanked me for my time, and drove away without another word. Over the next few months, I noticed small changes that seemed harmless at first. Survey crews appeared near the subdivision entrance. Real estate signs advertised future waterfront amenities. Brochures started showing artistic renderings of boats and boardwalks that looked strangely familiar. During one community open house, I picked up a glossy flyer from a coffee shop counter and nearly spilled my drink. There it was. My lake. My shoreline. My dock. The photograph had been edited so carefully that my property lines had disappeared completely. The caption called it a future shared recreational destination for Willow Ridge residents. I called the telephone number printed on the brochure expecting someone to apologize for an obvious mistake. Instead, I reached Victoria. Her voice remained calm and almost cheerful. She insisted the illustration represented a long-term community vision rather than a finalized project. She thanked me for my interest before ending the call, as if we had discussed the weather. That conversation stayed with me longer than I expected. Engineers develop good instincts because tiny details often predict much larger problems. Something about her confidence felt wrong. Most people hesitate before talking about property they do not own. Victoria spoke as though ownership itself were merely a technical inconvenience waiting to disappear. Curious, I drove around the neighborhood one Saturday afternoon. New model homes displayed giant maps showing walking trails, picnic areas, and a marina extending into the exact cove where my grandfather taught me to cast a fishing line. Families admired the displays without questioning whether the water belonged to the developer. Sales agents described future boating events and lakeside gatherings with polished enthusiasm. Every promise rested on one enormous assumption. They believed access to my lake was inevitable. That evening I unlocked the maintenance shed and listened to the familiar creak of its heavy wooden door. The cool air inside smelled faintly of machine oil, old paper, and cedar shells that had held my family's records for decades. I ran my hand across the control wheel before locking everything back in place. For reasons I could not fully explain, I suddenly felt grateful that my grandfather had always insisted on documenting every inch of this property. At the time I thought he was simply being meticulous. Standing there in the quiet, fading light, I began to suspect he had been preparing someone for a day exactly like this. I should have trusted that feeling because less than 3 weeks later the quiet mornings disappeared. I woke before sunrise to the low rumble of diesel engines echoing across the water. The sound rolled through the valley like distant thunder, followed by the sharp beeping of heavy equipment backing into position. When I stepped onto my porch with a mug of coffee, the bitter smell of fresh asphalt mixed with damp lake air hit me before I could even understand what I was seeing. Excavators stood along my shoreline. Flatbed trucks unloaded steel pilings. Concrete mixers crawled down a temporary access road that had not existed the day before. Workers in bright safety vests moved with practiced efficiency, measuring, drilling, and pouring foundations as though they had been hired months in advance. I drove straight to the shoreline and parked beside a stack of lumber nearly twice my height. The construction foreman greeted me politely and handed me a clipboard, assuming I was another inspector. When I explained that I owned the lake, his expression shifted from confidence to confusion. He flipped through several pages before pointing to a thick packet of plans stamped with county approvals and development permits. Every drawing identified the site as part of the Willow Ridge Community Waterfront Expansion Project. My name appeared nowhere. My property lines appeared nowhere. It was as if my family's history had simply been erased with a few strokes of a drafting pen. I asked him to stop the work until ownership could be verified. He apologized, said he was under contract, and explained that only the project owner could issue that instruction. 5 minutes later, a familiar white sport utility vehicle rolled onto the gravel access road. Victoria stepped out wearing sunglasses and carrying a leather portfolio. Even surrounded by cranes and bulldozers, she looked completely relaxed. She greeted me with the same polished smile I had seen months earlier, as though we were meeting for coffee instead of standing in the middle of my property. She explained that everything had been reviewed by professionals and assured me the project would benefit the entire area. When I reminded her that the lake was privately owned, she calmly replied that the legal details had been handled through the developer and that opposing progress would only create unnecessary conflict. Before I could answer, she handed me a glossy brochure showing computer-generated images of children fishing, families enjoying concerts by the water, and boats filling the marina at sunset. She spoke about community spirit, economic growth, and rising home values with the confidence of someone giving a sales presentation instead of discussing another person's property. Then she thanked the construction crew for their hard work and walked away while the machines started moving again. Day after day, the shoreline transformed. Massive cedar pilings disappeared beneath the water. Floating docks stretched farther into the cove. Electric pedestals, security cameras, decorative lighting, and polished stone walkways appeared almost overnight. By the end of the second week, a bronze entrance sign welcomed residents to their new waterfront destination. Luxury boats began arriving before the paint on the railings had even dried. Every evening, I stood quietly across the lake listening to hammers, generators, and nail guns echo over the water that my grandfather had spent decades protecting. They believed they were building a permanent landmark. I knew they were building something that depended entirely on a resource they had never bothered to understand. The marina was finished long before anyone in a courtroom could have reviewed a single document. Every morning, another delivery truck arrived carrying polished benches, decorative lighting, fresh landscaping, and expensive outdoor furniture. By the end of the month, it looked less like a construction site and more like a luxury resort. Families gathered along the boardwalk, taking photographs, while children pointed excitedly at boats rocking gently against floating docks that rested on water my family had managed for generations. Watching it happen felt surreal because I knew every smiling visitor believed they were standing on public community property. They had no idea they were walking across improvements built without my permission on privately owned land and water. I refused to let emotion make decisions for me. Engineers solve problems by collecting facts, not by raising their voices. I began making careful records. Every morning before work, I photographed the shoreline from the same locations. Every evening, I documented new structures, utility connections, retaining walls, lighting systems, and boat slips. I saved advertisements, promotional emails, newspaper articles, and social media posts celebrating the neighborhood's newest attraction. Then I contacted the county planning office. The employee who answered sounded surprised when I explained the situation. She promised to review the project file and return my call. 2 days later, she admitted that the permits referenced subdivision improvements, but suggested ownership disputes were outside her department. She recommended speaking with the county assessor. The assessor confirmed the tax records still listed every acre surrounding the lake under my name. He politely explained that his office did not enforce property rights. I called the sheriff's office next. A deputy met me beside the shoreline, listened carefully, reviewed my deed, and agreed the paperwork appeared legitimate. Then he looked across the water toward the completed marina and sighed. Because construction had already taken place and multiple parties claimed authority, he said the matter would almost certainly become a civil dispute rather than an immediate enforcement issue. His advice was simple: hire an attorney. I did exactly that. The first attorney studied my documents for nearly an hour before leaning back in his chair. He told me I appeared to have an exceptionally strong ownership claim, but obtaining an injunction after construction had finished could take months. Litigation involving developers, contractors, insurance companies, and a homeowners association would move slowly no matter how clear the facts seemed. While the legal process unfolded, the marina would likely remain open. That answer frustrated me more than I expected. Every additional weekend brought larger crowds, more boats, and more confidence from people who assumed the project had become untouchable simply because it already existed. Victoria seemed to enjoy that confidence. She appeared in local newspaper photographs cutting ribbons, welcoming new residents, and describing the waterfront as the crown jewel of Willow Ridge. During one televised interview, she thanked everyone who had helped transform an underused lake into a vibrant community destination. I watched the interview from my living room in complete silence. My father always warned me that confidence built on a false assumption eventually collapses under its own weight. Looking out my window at the evening sunlight reflecting across the water, I realized something important. Everyone around me was focused on who owned the shoreline. Almost nobody was asking the far more important question: who actually controlled the lake itself? I did not find the answer in a courtroom. I found it in dust. 3 evenings after speaking with my attorney, I unlocked the maintenance shed again and carried every binder, blueprint tube, and weathered storage box onto an old wooden workbench my grandfather had built decades earlier. The room smelled exactly as it had when I was a child, a mixture of cedar, machine oil, aged paper, and cool concrete that somehow made everything outside feel quieter. I worked until well after dark, turning brittle pages one by one beneath a single hanging work light. Most of the records were exactly what I expected: annual inspection reports, water quality tests, shoreline maintenance logs, handwritten notes from my father reminding himself to grease bearings before winter. Then I opened a dented gray metal box tucked beneath a stack of engineering drawings. Inside rested the same brass key I had carried since the morning of the grand opening, along with several sealed envelopes bearing my grandfather's careful handwriting. One envelope simply read, "If anyone ever forgets who owns the water." My heart actually skipped when I unfolded the letter. It was not emotional. It was practical, exactly the way he always approached problems. He explained that the lake depended on a regulated earthen dam constructed with state approval in the early 1960s and later modernized under federal engineering standards. Attached behind the letter were original permits, certified inspection reports, detailed elevation surveys, and operating agreements that had been renewed over the years without interruption. Every document pointed to one conclusion: ownership of the shoreline mattered, but operational authority over the dam mattered even more. I spread the engineering drawings across the table and immediately recognized my father's handwritten markings. They identified every control gate, discharge channel, inspection valve, and seasonal operating level. One page contained a highlighted paragraph requiring periodic water level adjustments for maintenance, shoreline preservation, and structural inspection, provided proper notice was given to the appropriate agencies downstream. It was not a loophole. It was a routine engineering procedure that had existed for decades before Willow Ridge was ever built. Curious, I drove to the county records office the following morning and requested archived files connected to the original permits. The clerk disappeared for nearly half an hour before returning with oversized folders that matched the documents sitting in my shed almost page for page. Every survey, every amendment, every inspection reinforced the same legal chain of authority. My family's ownership had never been interrupted. More importantly, responsibility for operating the dam had never been transferred. As I left the courthouse carrying certified copies, something finally became clear. Victoria had spent months assuming the visible part of the lake told the whole story. She focused on docks, boardwalks, landscaping, and property values because those were the things everyone could see. She never looked beneath the surface. She never asked why a private lake remained stable through droughts while neighboring ponds nearly disappeared. She never wondered who maintained the aging structure hidden beyond the cedar trees. Standing beside my truck with the afternoon sun reflecting off the courthouse windows, I realized I no longer needed to chase them. The documents were complete. The permits were valid. The engineering procedures were already written. All I had to do was follow the same rules my grandfather and father had respected for decades, patiently, carefully, and exactly as the law intended. From that moment on, I stopped reacting and started preparing. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed. Every afternoon, I drove past the marina at the same speed, nodded politely to construction crews finishing the last cosmetic details, and waved back whenever a homeowner recognized my truck. I wanted everyone to believe I had accepted the situation. That illusion became one of my greatest advantages. While the neighborhood admired polished railings and freshly planted flower beds, I spent my evenings following a very different checklist. I contacted the State Water Resources Office and submitted the required maintenance notification exactly as the operating agreement described. I informed the downstream conservation district that a scheduled water level adjustment would be performed for routine inspection of the dam structure and discharge channel. I hired an independent engineering consultant to inspect the control gates, so every maintenance action would be documented by a licensed professional. Every form was completed. Every signature was collected. Every notice was delivered within the required time frame. There were no shortcuts because shortcuts create problems in court. Precision creates protection. The consultant met me just after sunrise 2 days later. Together we walked the crest of the dam with clipboards in hand, while cool morning air drifted across the lake. He measured concrete joints, inspected drainage outlets, verified gate movement, and compared current water elevations with historical operating records. When he finished, he smiled and said something my grandfather would have appreciated. The structure was in remarkable condition because someone had never stopped maintaining it. Hearing those words felt like quiet confirmation that decades of careful work still mattered. After he left, I unlocked the maintenance shed and stood in front of the old control assembly. The brass key slid smoothly into its familiar place, polished by generations of careful hands. I did not turn it. Not yet. Instead, I cleaned the mechanism, lubricated the bearings, tested the gauges, and recorded every reading in the same maintenance log my father had used. Outside, the marina grew busier every day. Local newspapers announced an official grand celebration. For the following Saturday, food trucks would line the entrance. A local band would perform beside the waterfront clubhouse. Real estate agents planned guided tours highlighting premium lakefront homes. Victoria appeared in another promotional interview, describing the event as the beginning of a new era for Willow Ridge. Watching her speak, I noticed something almost amusing. She sounded completely certain that every variable had been accounted for. Engineers learn early in their careers that confidence without complete information is simply another form of risk. The evening before the celebration, I walked the shoreline alone as the sky turned deep orange behind the trees. Boats rested quietly in their assigned slips, gently tapping against brand new docks with soft rhythmic sounds carried across still water. Decorative lights reflected on the surface like tiny stars. Everything looked perfect, almost too perfect. I reached into my pocket and felt the familiar weight of the brass key once again. It was never a symbol of revenge. It represented responsibility, the same responsibility my family had carried for more than 60 years. The schedule had been approved. The inspections had been completed. The notifications had been acknowledged. By the time the first guests arrived the next morning believing they were about to celebrate an unforgettable success, every legal step had already been taken. All that remained was a routine maintenance procedure that would remind everyone, without a single raised voice, that appearances mean very little when someone else controls the water beneath your feet. Saturday morning arrived with flawless weather, the kind real estate developers pray for. Clear blue skies stretched above the lake while a light breeze carried the smell of grilled food, fresh coffee, and newly cut grass across the shoreline. By 9 o'clock, every parking space was full. Families wandered through the marina, taking photographs beside polished boats while children laughed as they tossed breadcrumbs toward ducks floating near the docks. A local band tuned their instruments beneath a white event tent, and television crews adjusted cameras for live interviews celebrating what everyone believed was the newest landmark in the county. I stood quietly near the maintenance shed wearing the same faded work boots I had used for years. Nobody paid attention to me. That was perfectly fine. My engineering consultant stood beside me reviewing the final inspection checklist one last time before nodding his approval. Every required notification had been acknowledged. Every maintenance procedure matched the operating agreement. I unlocked the weathered steel cabinet, inserted the old brass key, and slowly turned the control mechanism exactly as my grandfather had taught my father and my father had taught me. Deep beneath the surface, the discharge gates responded with a low mechanical vibration that traveled through the ground before disappearing into the steady sound of flowing water. There was nothing dramatic about it. No explosion. No sudden wave. Just the quiet beginning of a controlled maintenance release that had been performed many times over the past 6 decades. At first, nobody noticed. Victoria stepped onto the stage smiling confidently while thanking residents, contractors, and investors for helping transform the neighborhood. Applause echoed across the lake. Then a few boat owners glanced toward the water. The floating docks had settled slightly lower against their guideposts. 10 minutes later, the difference became impossible to ignore. Gentle ripples revealed exposed rocks that had been hidden beneath the surface only moments earlier. The waterline slowly retreated from the shoreline, leaving dark, wet earth behind. Children pointed toward the receding edge of the lake, while confused conversations spread through the crowd. Boat owners loosened docking lines as vessels gradually rested against the soft lake bed instead of floating freely. The elegant marina had been designed around a water level that no engineer working on the project had apparently verified with the person legally responsible for maintaining it. Within another hour, the transformation was astonishing. Wide stretches of firm brown mud emerged where sparkling water had reflected the morning sun. Floating docks settled unevenly as their support systems reached limits they had never been designed to handle during a scheduled drawdown. Decorative gangways rested at awkward angles. Television cameras that had arrived to celebrate ribbon cuttings now filmed reporters asking why an expensive waterfront attraction no longer had enough water to function. Victoria hurried from group to group, clutching her phone, while contractors examined plans with increasingly worried expressions. Nobody shouted. Nobody argued with me. There was very little to say. The consultant calmly continued recording water elevations while I completed the maintenance log exactly as every previous generation of my family had done. Standing there listening to the steady sound of controlled water flowing through the discharge channel, I realized the quietest moments often carry the greatest consequences. The marina had never truly belonged to the people who built it because they had forgotten the one lesson my grandfather considered impossible to ignore. Owning structures beside the water is meaningless when someone else lawfully controls the water itself. Over the following weeks, the excitement surrounding the marina disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. Engineers hired by the insurance companies inspected the site. Surveyors compared property boundaries with certified county records, and attorneys collected every permit, maintenance notice, engineering report, and ownership document connected to the project. For the first time since construction began, every piece of the story was examined together instead of separately. The conclusion was remarkably simple. My family had never surrendered ownership of the lake, the shoreline, or the operational authority over the dam. Every maintenance action I performed had followed the same documented procedures that had existed for decades, complete with proper notifications and professional inspections. The drawdown itself was never the legal problem. Building an expensive waterfront facility on privately owned land and assuming permanent water levels without coordinating with the lawful operator was. Once that became clear, everything else changed. Contractors began removing sections of the marina while legal discussions continued. The polished bronze entrance sign disappeared one quiet Tuesday morning before most residents had even finished breakfast. Boat slips were dismantled one by one. Decorative lighting came down. The floating docks that had once symbolized Willow Ridge's newest attraction slowly vanished from the shoreline. Victoria no longer appeared in promotional interviews celebrating community achievements. Instead, official meetings focused on insurance claims, construction contracts, and governance reviews. Several homeowners later stopped by my property, not to argue, but simply to apologize. Many admitted they had honestly believed the lake belonged to the subdivision because that was what they had been told from the beginning. I never blamed them. Most people trust the information placed in front of them. That is why facts matter so much. A few months later, I stood on the same weathered dock where my father had taught me how to cast a fishing line without tangling the line in nearby branches. The lake had gradually returned to its normal operating level after the scheduled maintenance was complete. Sunlight reflected across calm water exactly the way I remembered as a child. Ducks drifted quietly near the reeds. The only sounds were gentle waves against the shoreline and wind moving through the cedar trees. If someone had visited that afternoon without knowing the history, they never would have guessed that a multi-million-dollar project had once occupied the cove. The maintenance shed remained exactly where my grandfather built it. Inside, the brass key rested once again in its familiar place beside the engineering logs that now included one more carefully written entry. Sometimes people ask whether the entire experience was worth the stress. I always give the same answer. This was never about embarrassing anyone or proving that I was smarter than the people who underestimated me. It was about protecting something entrusted to my family long before I was born and honoring the responsibility that came with it. My grandfather used to say that water teaches patience because it never needs to rush to find its proper course. Looking across the quiet lake that evening, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Justice does not always arrive with loud speeches or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it arrives through careful preparation, respect for the law, and the quiet confidence that truth, like water, eventually settles exactly where it belongs.